that's a better phrase, won't be the rise of ocean, the level of oceans, won't be droughts in huge regions of the world, the higher frequency of extreme events like typhoons, hurricanes, etc. No. The first manifestations will be conflicts and wars triggered by massive migrations of people anticipating those events. So destruction of nature begets violence, but vice versa, violence begets destruction of nature. Because if we destroy nature, it's not because we hate nature. I mean, what could that mean? No, it's because we hate one another. And when in a situation of conflict, Michel said, our friend wrote beautiful things about this, in a situation of conflict, let's say between two violent persons, the most terrible blows are not those received by the violent people themselves, but the third parties, received by the innocent third parties. And nature, here, is the innocent third party. So we are caught in this loop, and if we don't do anything, I mean, this loop will rotate more and more and more and more, and will get the escalation to the utmost extreme. Of course, I'm referring here to René's most recent book, Achever Clausewitz. And this is a quote from Clausewitz himself: to introduce into the philosophy of war itself a principle of moderation would be an absurdity. War is an act of violence, which in its application knows no bounds, as one takes the law to the other, and here the other is the dialectic between destruction of nature and pure violence. There arises a sort of reciprocal action, which in the conception must lead to an issue. No way to do otherwise. Our ethical situation, even if you are less pessimistic than the keepers of the doomsday clock, it remains that our way of life, especially when I say ours, I mean us who live in so-called developed countries, is in the long term, 20 years, 30 years, irremediably doomed. One would be hard-pressed to imagine how it could last more than 50 years, half a century. Thus, we find ourselves with our backs to the wall. We need to say what is more important to us: our ethical imperative of equality, which leads to principles of universalization, what is good for me is good for the others, and vice versa, or else our mode of development. We cannot have our cake and eat it, we have to choose here. Either the privileged part of the planet isolates itself, which increasingly means that it protects itself with shields of all sorts against the aggressions which the resentment of those left behind will render ever crueler and more abominable, or else another type of relationship to the world, to nature, to things and beings must be invented, one capable of being universalized on a humanity-wide scale. Let me introduce three of my favorite philosophers here, most favorite philosophers, called at times Heidegger's children. The three of them were German Jews, and all of them were students of a Nazi philosopher called Martin Heidegger. Hannah Arendt, who as we know was more than a student of Heidegger's. Hans Jonas, the founding father of the so-called precautionary principle, Vorsorgeprinzip in German. And someone who is much less known, although he's my favorite. He was, but that's anecdotal, Hannah Arendt's first husband, or I should say, she was his first wife, Günther Anders, and their common master, Heidegger. Let's say a few words about Hans Jonas. So those people wrote, let's say in the late 50s, early 60s, and for them, of course, the major catastrophe was not before them, it was behind them. That goes without saying. So Hans Jonas, in this very important book, which everyone should have read, really, in English it's The Imperative of Responsibility, the subtitle is Search on Ethics for the Technological Age. published in English in 1985, introduces the notion of a new ethics that he calls ethics of the future. But in German it's Ethik für die Zukunft, which means not a future ethics, but an ethics for the future, an ethics for the sake of the future. That is, the future must become the major object. The conservation of the future, of the capacity for the future, must become the major object of our concern. And he introduces this notion starting from a philosophical aporia, impasse, which can be expressed in the following terms. Given the magnitude of the possible consequences of our technological choices, it is an absolute obligation for us to try and anticipate those consequences, assess them, and ground our choices on this assessment. Let me, for those of you who are not familiar with those notions, introduce two fundamental notions in moral philosophy: consequentialism and the ontology. Consequentialism is a moral doctrine. For instance, utilitarianism is a case in point, for which what counts in evaluating an action is its consequences, and only its consequences. Whereas for the ontology, the Kantian doctrine is a case in point, or the Rawlsian doctrine today, the ontology has it that the rightness of an action must be expressed or understood in terms of its conformity to a norm or a rule posed as a categorical or absolute imperative. The clash between consequentialism and the ontology is best seen or illustrated in the case of sacrificial choice. For instance, Caiaphas' choice. It's better that one man die for people and that the whole nation doesn't perish. If you are a consequentialist, you will say only the consequences matter. So Caiaphas is right, and that's Caiaphas' choice. If you are the ontologist, you say there is an absolute norm. Never kill anyone, any innocent person, and you will accept to not maximize the consequences by respecting this absolute norm. Okay. So what Hans Jonas is telling us here is when the stakes are huge, and here they are, because we're talking about the survival of the human species, we cannot afford not to choose consequentialism rather than the form of the ontology. However, the very same reasons that make consequentialism, that is, we should take into account only the consequences of our actions, compelling, and therefore oblige us to anticipate the future, make it impossible for us to do so. Why? Because precisely the magnitude of our power of action into the world is such that we are capable of triggering complex phenomena, complex dynamics, which make it impossible to predict the consequences of our actions. Unleashing complex processes is a very perilous activity that both demands foreknowledge and prohibits it. Now, one of the very few unassailably universal ethical meta-principles in ethics is that ought implies can. That is, there is no obligation to do that which you cannot do. I mean, there is no moral obligation for me to fly because I can't fly. However, and this is the aporia, in the technological age, according to Hans Jonas, we do have an ordered obligation that we cannot fulfill, anticipating the future. And that is the ethical aporia. And we need a new kind of ethics, which Jonas called the ethics for the future. I'm not sure he really succeeded in setting it up. My word, I mean, I don't want to sound presumptuous here, was precisely to try to maybe to improve on his solution.